With that, I want to talk a little bit about what we've learned. So in hundreds of Copilot deployments now, many customers are going through work where they're trying to really maximize the value of AI, and they're working through all sorts of legacy and debt resolution to get there. And as we think about AI, I thought it would be good to just kind of set the stage. Today, we all feel the very real challenge that expectations continue to rise significantly because we see increasing volume, variety, and velocity in our work, right? We see more volume in content. We see more variety in the apps and the experiences that we have to use. We see more velocity, meaning speed of our response and our responsiveness. And IT needs to shift more and more from reactive because it's just not fast enough to a proactive stance and approach. And so today I want to talk about how you might be able to bridge this gap between these two bars. But I also want to talk about the very real challenges, especially in the Q&A, of AI, because AI can help bridge this gap, but it can also exponentially and near limitlessly increase expectations. So how do we bridge that effectively will be a key part of today's discussion. And I hope some of the ideas that I shared today will help you using the slides. Feel free to use them internally or using some of the ideas. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about is some stats. So in 2024, in January of 2024, we know based on a number of different research studies, we know based on a number of different surveys and reports that generally speaking, the vast majority of customers were in the earlier stages of AI. Things like Copilot for Microsoft 365, which is what it was called then, now it's called Copilot, Microsoft 365 Copilot. That capability was in what we call the planning, the exploration, and the early stage, which is pilot-based, small-scale pilot implementation state. So those are, think of like if we have 5 lanes, those are the beginning of the sequence. So in 2024, we were early. It was all about AI readiness. And every organization, that's what we were talking about. In 2025, it's important to understand that that has shifted. The majority of customers are now not focusing on planning and exploring AI, but they're focusing on piloting, scaling, and realizing more value out of their AI investments. And that's a big shift from last year. And so as we start this year, I hope that a lot of these things will help you understand how you can accelerate your AI investments and get more value out of them. But importantly, if you are in that category of people that are still exploring, still planning, still getting in the readiness state, it is important to note that you are a little bit behind, that the majority of customers have started to proceed with piloting and scaling scenarios as we enter 2025. And so this is a real challenge because if you're an IT leader, you feel that. You feel the challenge of, fighting fires every day, the pressing priorities, and advancing AI's impact. Last year, it was the priority challenge, the firefighting, as well as AI readiness. This year, the big challenge is how do we accelerate that AI ROI? How do we accelerate the benefit from it? And so I thought I'd break this down into 3 different categories. We'll talk about the velocity, then the variety, and then the volume, because AI doesn't just affect us in one way from an IT perspective. It affects us in 3 major ways. The first one is around this transition from months or years, if we're lucky, in terms of cycle time. And I won't get into the whole breakdown of how AI is transformative and that this era of AI, this post-generative AI, is different than previous ones. But what I will explain to you is a little bit more about those stats that I mentioned earlier. So if you think about it, and this is one of my favorite visual examples of it, this is coming from Microsoft work with Ipsos and others, and we see this great analogy of how do people kind of get to value from AI. And they do it through going through a journey. They go through exploring, then planning, then implementing, then scaling, then realizing. And these stages of value creation are important because what we want to do in a perfect world is accelerate from the left to the right faster. And we want to do that because then our business benefits, we as an organization, especially an IT group, are leading that transformative change, and we're not necessarily falling behind or being displaced by other groups. Bring Your Own AI has its own challenges, which we'll talk about, but we do want to address this. So if we look at those stats from earlier, what we're saying is in the last year, again, most customers were in exploring planning, which is all about AI readiness, still important because AI readiness is a continual thing that needs to continually adapt and change as we look at agents and new forms of AI capabilities. Remember, it's an always near limitless number of capabilities, so it keeps changing over time. And then we need to think about implementing. I like the term piloting for implementing. Think of how you pilot, then you scale rolling pilots, then you eventually get to a fully implemented, scaled version of digital assistants across your organization. And then we really get into things like maximizing the ROI, which is about process and quality improvements and not just the productivity ones. In fact, again, for this year, the emphasis is going to be that we want to be in this group on the right, and we want to be one of the more successful businesses on the right. So what has IT always wanted? IT has always wanted to be a transformer, not someone who just fights fires, but every IT leader wants to proactively work at the business and solve problems, improve processes, improve outcomes. And so the good news is, based on lots of research and evidence, we know that the further you are in your journey with AI, the more you get not just substantial or significant return on investment, right? You get much more significant return in these later stages. But importantly, the ways you measure and the ways that you value the benefit you're getting from AI shift towards growth focus from efficiency and cost focus. And so that's important. Again, in 2024, it was all about efficiency and cost focus. It's all about readiness. In 2025, it's all about implementing, scaling, and realizing, which is a lot more about growth focus, measures, and metrics. If this is overwhelming, think of it like this. You have different ways in which you measure your readiness. You measure how are you getting towards realizing more value. And as you look at your own organization and where you trend on that, you get a sense of, where your maturity needs gaps and support, and where IT especially needs to lean in and be a bit more proactive, or where it might need more funding or more outside support and services, whether that's third-party tooling like ShareGate, which we'll talk about today, or whether it's great partners like Lead and others that can help you through that process. What is important is that there's an answer to all of these, how to get from one stage to another, how to accelerate that journey. And in today, we'll talk through a couple tangible examples of that. So this has been about velocity. The idea is we're measuring this in years or months, not in decades, right? It's a very quick change from an IT perspective. So let's break this down in a different way. When I'm in boardrooms and I'm talking with a lot of business leaders and I'm supporting IT, a lot of times what ends up happening is there's this question of why is this so important? There's differences of opinion on terms of whether AI is oversaturated in terms of its importance or value. And so it's important that we are all on the same page that this is about an exponential technology, not a linear one. Most technologies are these step progressions, right? We go through this sequence where the technology adds value, but there's a bit of a plateau or at least a line that doesn't increase as much. Think of hybrid work. Once you achieve a relatively parallel capability set in hybrid work for the remote employees versus the on-prem employees, we generally think that that's pretty good. And now we just continually iterate and improve on it. So there's a big lift, and then there's this kind of plateauing or slower climb. That's what we call linear technology change. But when we look at something like AI, the capabilities continue to enrich. We now have new agent capabilities, especially in 2025. And so you're going to see that this near limitless potential means that there's near limitless ways that we need to manage risk and we need to address this. So it's all about treating things like a service, adoption like a service, governance like a service, instead of treating it like projects or one-off investments. And once that's understood and that the business needs to lead this because it's an exponential change, not just a linear one, it becomes a little bit easier to then talk about what do we need to do. Because what we want is we want to be in a position where we're benefiting from this change. We're benefiting and we're leading, our industry. We're providing better health outcomes for, if you're a healthcare organization, to your patients. You're providing better educational attainment, to your students. Whatever your drivers are, we want to be able to show how we can become a better organization and achieve these outcomes. And to do that, we have to bridge the gap from where we are today, from where we need to be on this exponential curve of AI. And when you think about it that way, it becomes really important to frame what kind of IT investments help us achieve that, right? Scaled security and governance, of course, copilots and adaptive automation, so digital assistants at scale. Employee experience investments are really important for learning, for how people connect. This is a very peer-based approach to change. And then, of course, we have big things like migration, modernization, connection consolidation, things that reduce our firefighting and also AI enable some of the data and systems and processes that we work on today. So let's break one of these down. How do you bridge between where we are today and the future? Well, if we take migration, the number one mistake in migrations that we know is that we treat them as one project. We try and do everything at once. You take the content that's being migrated from, you say, a SharePoint server or a file share, we restructure it, we try and optimize it, we do all that work. And then what we end up doing is we find that the optimization, this right side, restructuring optimization, continues to climb and increase in scope. It leads to delays, it leads to confusion on who owns the project, it leads to challenges and delays in doing the migration in the first place. And so one of the best things you can do if you want to get this bridging faster is to split the migration project into 2 projects. In one side of the project, you do, of course, the migration, kind of a lift and shift with foundational restructuring. A good example of foundational restructuring is, let's say I have a classic SharePoint site over here, and I have a modern SharePoint site in this new environment, the SharePoint Online environment. What I'll do is I'll create that site, and then I'll migrate the content from the classic one into the modern one. That's what we call foundational restructuring, or flattening. If you have a lot of subsites, flattening that out. There are a number of different things you can do, whether we're talking about file shares, Google migrations, tenant to tenant, SharePoint to SharePoint migrations that we can do that are, I would classify as foundational. Those are fair. Those are part of lift and shift. But so much else, is about optimization. Changing how people work is about optimization. And it's easier to do that online and in the cloud. In the example of file shares, since I used a SharePoint one earlier, in the example of a file share migration, one of the problems in file shares is we can't see who viewed content. We can't see if they downloaded content, but you do get that automatically once it's in the cloud. So in many organizations, we struggle. No one, garbage in, garbage out. No one wants to delete anything, and that's fair. They don't know if it's been viewed or used. But in the cloud, we can answer those questions. So what's the value? We lift and shift people into the cloud sooner, keep a lot of the structure that they have today in terms of folders and things like that, and let them work in that cloud environment while we work on optimization as not a project really, but a set of services. Essentially, splitting these two into 2 projects leads to tremendous success and makes a huge difference. And this is important because this optimization project is really training us how to do optimization like a service. And that's really important in this generative AI era, in this post-AI generative AI era that we're in. And this is important too, because ShareGate doesn't just help with migrations, but it can also help us with this optimization and making it more easy to program, to automate, and to just make that whole process more streamlined and simple. So that was one example of many. If I had more time, I'd go into others. What we're saying here is that we need to bridge this gap and that there are answers for how to do it a little bit more effectively. That's my favorite example for migration that customers still make mistakes on, and I hope it helps you. On the other side of it, we also need to think about scaling security and lifecycle management. And earlier I mentioned this challenge with AI is that it's not static. It continues to evolve and change. So today you can use great tools like ShareGate Protect and partners and services to understand what are the readiness state for your organization. How effectively are we not just ready for AI now, but what is our readiness state a few months from now? Right? Relooking at this type of information can be very valuable to see if we've improved that readiness and which ways we've made adaptive changes, programmatic changes, hopefully, and other things that help us improve. So the idea, again, is we bridge, whether it's through migration, whether it's through integration scenarios, whether it's through customizations, plugins, and now we have these agent frameworks. The point is we need to bridge that. Now, if you don't bridge that, right, if we delay our bridging or some of those investments, what that means is it's a steeper climb. It means that it's harder for users. It's harder for the IT to lead. It has higher costs associated with it. And there is a pretty big competitive disadvantage that occurs here. And that is a big deal when AI is accelerating, not slowing down. So the longer you wait, it's actually much, like there's multiples of impact in terms of cost. And so again, if you're in that small quadrant of people that are still in the readiness and exploration, I'm not trying to stress you out, but use what I'm saying here. Reach out to me, help me help with you accelerate that journey, because you do need to do that in the very near term. So then let's talk about, instead of just talking about velocity, let's talk then about variety. Because variety is a separate challenge. Not only do we need to do things sooner and in years if we're lucky, but now we also have to deal with this increasing variety. And my favorite example of this is return on investment, because remember, the idea here is how do we accelerate in 2025 our AI journey? Well, the good news is there are wonderful pre-built calculators. There's wonderful experiences like ShareGate has a great cost calculator as an example that help us understand productivity gains and help us understand what I would consider more traditional IT evaluations of impact, of things that help us make decisions, help us prioritize investments better. Where people struggle isn't doing that. What people struggle with today is that we're really good on the right side here. This AI for process automation, that red, we're good at that. We do a good job at measuring that, most IT organizations today. IT really struggles with the left side because AI as a digital assistant, or Copilot in Microsoft technology scenarios, is really about being a digital assistant framework. And that is where I want to be really clear, that is where the highest ROI is right now. And that is hard because IT is not used to measuring these types of qualitative improvements. They're not used to measuring things that require, like a service or adoption or an always increasing expectation curve along with an always increasing capability curve. And so this means that we need to get better, not just about implementing, piloting, and readying stuff here, but also really understanding what's driving realization of value and how do we tune and augment for that. Let me put it a different way. On the right-hand side, you see this picture. What I'm saying is the most important gear in this is the digital assistant gear. And if we get that gear running really well, it will power the other gears and accelerate your work there. If you just try and do the process automation without doing the hard work of digital assistants today, you'll find that users you have to now uplift in projects for process automation. You need to now help them understand AI. You need to help them learn these patterns. You need to help them learn everything from prompting to data, ethics and management to all sorts of other things. And not only that, but then you have to pay for the migration project work in that one particular project, in that one around that process, instead of doing it more holistically to enable all of your processes to be improved with AI. So the digital assistant one isn't just the first gear that you want to work on. It's the key gear that drives the rest of it. And today it's the most stable of these. We have the best data and we have the best experiences in that space today, whereas the others are still maturing. One last way to think about it, like an upside down triangle. We're working on modern AI enablement. Hopefully you already done that in 2024. In 2025, we're focusing on digital assistants at scale and functional agents. That means moving away from productivity measures, not that they're not important, but maturing in our focus into quality measures, maturing in our focus into process measures and things like that. Another way to think about this, if you are at the stage where you think of AI, you think of Copilot as prompting, then you're only looking at a small percentage of what Copilot's capable of today. Every one of these circles is what Copilot can do today in production, at least in North America. You have actions, you have agents, agents, an example that would be a facilitator agent. You have agents, orchestrating agents like the project management agent. These are shipped experiences, and there are many more coming. And customers themselves are building around these. And so what we're really saying is it's not, when I say all this stuff about ROI and scaling, we're not just scaling prompting and using, it within Excel or Word. We're talking about using it across workflows and across processes. And that is all about these later stages that you see here where the business value increases, as does the importance, the key priority of proactive governance and optimization, because you're not going to be able to keep up otherwise. Again, think of that visual on the left. We got to make this connection between the two of them. All right. So I've talked about that not long enough. A lot of these slides will be available again afterwards, as well as in the recording. But I want you to think about ROI not as a way to prove that we need to make more investments, but to help figure out what to invest more in and what to invest less in. The idea is to help use ROI because it's so powerful as a way to help us optimize and prioritize better. And it is important in 2025. Now, I'm going to skip over these two slides. I know they're dense. These are more for the recording and again, as a leave behind in the slides that you guys can get access to. But there is good reasons for why this is a challenge. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but I do want to highlight that there are ways to measure these things and they're proven. And when you measure them, I'm going to simplify with a quick visual. What you see is three things. You see that if you responsibly enable AI effectively, you're going to get good ROI, right? If you just do it the right way, you use ShareGate, you do responsible readiness, you're using different tools to make sure that you're governing and managing things, you're going to get ROI. If you invest in adoption the right way, that's team-based adoption, peer-based adoption, other things like that, allotting licenses not to individuals that are digitally excellent, but allotting them to entire teams of people, saturating, all those things, you get what we call compounding returns on adoption. You want programmatic compounding returns. And then you see this little data sliver, as well as this process, this very large triangle of process value. And what that is we see, and again, I cannot share new data, unfortunately. We've asked many times to figure out ways to do this. We're just not that great at figuring out the right approvals because customers see this as a competitive advantage. But I will tell you strongly that while I do believe adoption is a multiplier on ROI, you can get like 300% adoption improvement just by focusing on team-based nominations and team-based deployments and things like that versus individual. It's the process automation stuff that really makes the big ROI. And this is the mistake people make. It's not about capital P processes. It's about lowercase p processes or people processes. So imagine, you have an order that comes in, it goes into SAP, and then eventually gets shipped on a truck. And so between the SAP order and the shipping on the truck, there is this sequence of processes, people processes that are happening throughout the business. These are exceptions. And people use email, they use Outlook, they use Teams, they use the Microsoft stack, especially 365, to manage those exceptions. And what we're talking about with these digital assistants at scale, with Copilot, is that it's actually about the lowercase p processes or the people-based processes that we're automating. Super important to understand that, because if an organizational leadership understands that their real competitive differentiation is actually from their lowercase p processes, then they're in a position where they're going to value these investments in these digital assistants, because it means that everyone can digitize their processes more, improve, and innovate in new ways that they're unexpected. Let me put it a different way. When AI improves, I don't know, ERP systems for an insurance org, it improves ERP systems for all insurance orgs, and they all get lifted under that, right? Because they're all very similar. But those lowercase p processes of how individuals work in the organization is often really what competitively differentiates one org from another. And it certainly leads to those 10x or significant growth opportunities through creativity, through unlocking potential, through a variety of other things. And so the more we invest in these digital systems at scale, the more we're leaning into investments around the value of people and the processes of people in the organization. And that's really important when we think about this AI journey. Now, I've got two more. These are more leave behind visuals, two more examples just to prove there's lots of ways to calculate this, and it can be done either simply, like in a little Excel like this, or more complex in a more complex way, but that you should create your own customized calculator over time, because measuring this stuff is important from an IT perspective and a leader perspective. It allows us to be more proactive in how we approach. It allows us to understand the value of surveys and qualitative data, not just quantitative ones. Another way to think about all of what I've said. Today, we are failing. IT is not meeting the needs of AI demand quick enough in organizations, and this is proven through study after study that shows bring your own AI on the rise, that shows more and more fragmentation of AI tool usage, and a lot more struggles where people aren't getting the training or support they need from the org. Now, that's okay. That's good, because I'm going to tell you something really important. Today, AI moves so quickly, we want that independence. We want bring your own AI. But we need to do it in a way where we can shift that towards orchestration, to shift that towards us engaging with those different groups and optimizing the way that they work. We need to work towards not just like saying, no, you can't use this tool anymore, but instead saying, why are you using it? How's it helping you? You're using, Jasper for marketing. Great. Tell me a little bit more about that. What's working well with it? Let's start to work towards portfolio objectives where we're trying to improve communications, and that happens to include marketing. And so we're looking at insights from those tool usages as well as what could be replaced by Copilot. And then we look at optimization over time and other things. If you're measuring ROI, not just about Copilot, but you're measuring ROI on AI as a whole, that's when you get the right outcomes. So we're working towards this, but you have to still support independence, because in these moments of change, these big transformative events, it's really important to be agile as an organization. And that does mean it's okay that people experiment and try things. We just need to make sure they're protected. And that brings us to the last of these important waves of change. If we address proactive IT in velocity and variety, we still need to address the very real challenge of it working in a volume sense. The first thing to note here is that when we think about AI and we think about the way people work, in Microsoft 365, collaboration is compliant by design. They're not at odds. If you're using those tools and you implement things like labels, as an example, well, then when you use AI like Copilot, it inherits those capabilities. So if I have a file like this one that has a label applied to it, and I create something from that file using Copilot today, it will inherit those labels. That's important, because then that means that it doesn't really matter how people use these AI tools if we can ensure that the most important or the most critical data is protected in the right ways. Then it doesn't matter where it goes to. And just to kind of really emphasize this point, what we're used to as IT is managing service-centric sensitivity and lifecycle. Many of us do a pretty good job of understanding, like, hey, OneDrive has a disposition. It goes like this. This is how we're going to manage it. And so that's how we kind of think through our process. And there's new things with that. Like, how do we deal with those Copilot pages people are using for collaboration? There's always new challenges at the service-centric level, but most organizations are pretty successful there. Where organizations are still struggling is container-centric sensitivity and lifecycle. Think of things like teams and sites and how do we manage those. But today, in 2025, it's not sufficient anymore. It's necessary, but not sufficient to just manage at the container level. You need to be managing at scale in a programmatic and a scalable AI way with proactive approaches at the document-centric layer. And that is a big shift for a lot of organizations. And it's critical because that's how these Copilot tools and many others work. In fact, in that example where you might take that data and put it into Gemini or into Jasper or whatever, some other system, the nice thing is if we do this right, we can make sure that it's protected regardless of what people use, so that things like Defender or other tools can block the copy paste mechanics from those other sensitive files, and that they can still use Copilot to do all these really important things because that's a more secure managed solution. But these other ones, which again, there's 380 plus, they keep growing. That's okay for people to use, but now at least we know that it's not creating new exposure risks on the sensitive content in our organization. So what does that mean? It means it's not just important to get to that document-centric level, but people really struggle with this thing called purview. They struggle with getting to the labels. And there's an answer to this. There's 10 steps. These are the 10 steps. If you did this, you would implement data governance at the content layer correctly. This is the secret to purview. And when you do this right, you essentially find that the two most important steps, in my opinion, are intelligent default labels, which gives you 99% of your cases based on the container. Container, remember, is the site or the team. Well, as I mentioned, while people still struggle with it, it's the place that we're most successful with today compared to documents. So why is it then that if we have the answers and we know how to do this, that organizations struggle to implement these tools at scale and in an accelerated way? Well, it turns out it's not cost. I want to be clear. It's not about E5s. It's not about the cost. It's about the expertise and experience. It's about knowing how to do it. That's what we find time and time again is the challenge. And so there are answers there, of course, with third parties, with Microsoft Research and Materials, with community, with services organizations like Tutorlead. There are answers to do this quicker. But I also want to highlight that it's not just about understanding how to roll this out. It's about understanding how it connects with things that we already know. See, the thing is, if you want to do this, number 5, intelligent default labels at the container level, you need to understand what managed sprawl is versus unmanaged sprawl. Managed sprawl is basically when we know the sites and teams and spaces that we have. You can ask a question like, how many sites do we have that relate to department equals HR? And we can get that answer. How many relate to a client? How many relate to a product? How many relate to this or that? If you can't answer those questions, I would argue you have what is called unmanaged sprawl. Sprawl is not bad. Unmanaged sprawl is. So how do we manage it? Well, again, simplifying a lot here, we automate processes for provisioning. Again, ShareGate can help a lot with this. So we automate the process for provisioning. So when we create new spaces, we understand more about them. We ask questions, we get more insight about it, and we manage it in a more facilitated programmatic way. We also ask those questions because we want to know about this space. Tell me more about this. And this makes a big difference. If you ask a simple question like which department it relates to, you now have the ability to notify someone who's the department lead, hey, a new space was created in your department. And that leads to reduced redundancy. That leads to them going, oh, we actually have a similar space. They work it out. And now we can archive that space that's been provisioned at a later time. Or people even stop in the middle of provisioning because it becomes this discussion on approvals that gets visibility to different department leads. So again, these are just examples, but having this data, having these discussions, having little changes to the process leads to all sorts of new opportunities. And again, this is a lot harder to do out of the box. So I highly encourage exploring third-party tools or ways in which you can do this with support. And so this is a great example with ShareGate where you can automate that provisioning and you can ask them those questions even after the sites have been created. Even after they've been created, we can do different types of lifecycle management scenarios and things like that.